The woman stood before me in tears, panicking, and she said, "I haven't heard from my family all day. They're supposed to be here. This is the day that they're supposed to come and visit." You see, she was in a rehabilitation facility, and this is the one day she expected to see her family, and yet she hadn't heard from them. And so she was panicking and she was anxious and asked me if, can I use the phone to call them? And I thought about it and said, I don't see why not. It seemed like a reasonable request. So I asked the others there if she could have the permission to do that. And just then, head counselor came out and told her, and you know, granted, just so you know, it gives some background. I knew this woman was a woman of faith, and she was a Christian. She told me she had been praying that day. She was trying to surrender to God. And this counselor came out and told her, you need to go back into your room and pray about it. What really upset me was I knew this counselor wasn't a believer. At least she never professed to, and she seemed to be a bit antagonistic toward the idea. And so then I was a bit upset that she would tell my client that she should go pray when A, she didn't believe in it, and B, she made an assumption that my client wasn't, and she had been, in fact. Many times, unfortunately, there's many times when people make this assumption that somehow if people are struggling, that they're not spiritual enough or that they need more faith, when the reality is that many times people do have faith and they are trying to surrender to God. So unfortunately, this whole idea of just pray about it, it's unfortunate that many times the people misuse spirituality and misunderstand that not everything is related to mental health, or that not everything is necessarily spiritual. Don't get me wrong, prayer has helped many people. I knew an elderly man who said he was addicted to alcohol, and one day he decided to pray about it, and he gave it to God, and he surrendered it in prayer. And when he opened his he said he never had a desire for alcohol again. But that was a miracle. I mean, that seems like a miracle. But the reality is that for every miracle story I've heard, there's 10 more people who have struggled, and they do pray and they do surrender to God. But the reality is that they still struggle, whether it's an addiction or they have a physical or mental disease. Many people are surrendering it to God, but for whatever reason, it hasn't changed. It reminds me of the Apostle Paul, who described how he wrestled with a thorn in the flesh, and he prayed, and the answer was God's grace is sufficient for him. Sometimes God doesn't always answer our prayers the way we want. But does that mean that our spirituality and faith is not enough, or it's not strong enough? We've also heard stories about how Christians misuse prayer, or they try to use prayer to heal something instead of going to a doctor. And people have tried to pray away mental illnesses such as depression. They've tried to pray away cancer. People have tried to pray away suicidality. They tried to pray away attraction to someone of the same sex. And the unfortunate thing is when people try to pray about these things, but it doesn't work, then they give up on God, or they think that God isn't there. When maybe the reality is the answer isn't just to pray about it. Maybe there's something else that needs to happen. Maybe we need to accept the situation, or maybe we need to see a medical doctor. Like if you have a broken bone, would you pray about it? Same thing with mental illness. If you need medication, maybe you need it. There's an old story about how, you might have heard this, about how someone prayed to God. He was in the middle of a flood, and he was on a boat, or he was on the top of his house, right? And he needed to be rescued. And so he prayed to God to rescue him, right? So God sends him a boat and then helicopter and all these things. And he said, well, I was waiting for God. You've heard the story, right? And the reality is that God works through people. He works through the sciences. And and that those are legitimate answers to prayer as well. Prayer should not replace using our brains. We still need to take care of our health. We need to exercise. We need to eat healthy food, get adequate sleep. We should not be surprised then if we are abusing our bodies and we end up getting sick. Prayer should not replace medical treatment, prescription drugs, counseling, and sometimes just accepting our situation. Many people, unfortunately, hold a spiritual belief that if they just will something to happen, it will happen. And this comes from this idea, this dualistic mind-body belief, this idea that we have this spirit that is separate in our bodies, and therefore we don't need to worry about our physical bodies, and that somehow our physical health won't affect our spirituality, and vice versa. But the reality is, as we're going to see, that our body and mind are one, and that there's no entity that's floating out around in our body. Unfortunately, that mindset has contributed to impeding scientific progress in psychology for hundreds of years. And so we're going to take a look at, we're going to deconstruct that belief. And we're going to look at how we can take a holistic, whole person approach to our mind and body as well. So let's talk about the main point. There have been some challenges in integrating faith and science as people hold, in both fields, hold suspicions of the other. The belief in a spiritual mind that exists apart from the body, like I said, has hindered our understanding of how the brain is a physical organ that shapes our behavior, which has led many religious people to assume that our behavior is something we can simply will or pray to change. And however, many people find ways to integrate their faith and understanding of science. Nevertheless, religious faith and specific beliefs can be either toxic or beneficial to our physical and mental health, depending on what it's like. And so that's why religion should remain in dialogue with sciences. That way we make sure that our religion is not toxic and that it's helpful too. So let's take a look at how do we integrate our faith and science. So in this chapter, we'll identify some obstacles to integrating faith and science. You'll explore how various people integrate their faith and science, particularly psychology, since that's what the subject is about. You'll discuss how religious and spiritual beliefs affect our mental health. We'll also discuss how religious and spiritual beliefs affect how we care for our physical health, because that's an outcome of our mental health. In the first section, we'll take a look at how people of faith and science have often been suspicious of each other. As discussed in the previous chapter, Christians have historically been suspicious of scientific theories that contradict the Bible or leave God out of the picture. Thus, the publication of psychological theories that went against church teachings were often punished by the church. The suppression of scientific discovery may have contributed to the dark ages of psychology. In fact, many early psychological theories, such as phrenology, were essentially pseudoscience. The loosening of the stranglehold on science by the church has allowed for the enlightenment and the flourishing of ideas in the scientific revolution, as we'll see. Scientists have also been suspicious of religion, and also rightly so. Scientists, including psychologists, have been suspicious of religions for several reasons. One of the main problems with religion is that it has been misused to control and oppress people. Many of the wars throughout history have been due to religious conflict. Religion has been a cover for a broken system that preys on children, and religion has trapped people in abusive relationships by using fear and guilt to keep people from leaving. One of the problems with integrating faith and science is known as the God of the gaps fallacy. That is, anytime we do not understand something scientifically, believers use God as an explanation. Atheistic scientists point out that as science advances, religion explains less and less. Now, this is a quote from Hippocrates, the father of medicine. He wrote, "People think that epilepsy is divine simply because they don't have any idea what causes epilepsy. But I believe that someday we will understand what causes epilepsy," which we do now, And at that moment, we will cease to believe that it's divine. And so it's with everything. It is with everything in the universe. Whether or not Christians or other theists accept Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, it cannot be argued that he released the field of biology from the stranglehold of religion by offering a scientific, non-religious explanation for the origins of life. The scientist Richard Bube, who happens to be a Christian, he wrote this book, The Human Quest: A New Look at the Science and the Christian Faith. He wrote in 1978 that Darwin's theory was the death knell of the God of the gaps, meaning this idea that we keep squeezing God into the leftovers of science was done away with because Darwin explained potentially the last possible thing that religion was using to explain. So I want to show you a brief video clip. This is a trailer from Stephen Hawking's Grand Design. And we will take a look at what he says. Stephen Hawking is an important scientist that we're going to look at again later. And so this is from his documentary series on looking at the origins of the universe and the intersection with faith.
Hello. My name is Stephen Hawking, physicist, cosmologist, and something of a dreamer. Although I cannot move, and I have to speak through a computer, in my mind,
I am free. Free to explore the deepest questions of the universe. Among them, the deepest of all. Is there a God who created and controls the universe, from the stars and the planets to you and me? Finding out takes us on a journey through the laws of nature. For there, I think, lies the answer to the age-old mystery of how the universe was made and how it really works.
Check it out.
The renowned physicist and cosmologist Stephen Hawking explained why he was an atheist in his 2010 book, The Grand Design. He said that it is not necessary to invoke God to start the universe. He also said that one can't prove that God doesn't exist, but science makes God unnecessary. So before, it used to be that God was invoked to explain everything, but science did away with that. Now, am I suggesting that we don't need to believe in God? Not necessarily. No, I'm not at all. All I'm saying is simply that it is futile to always reserve God for the unexplainable. Perhaps we can see how God works through science, and that would be an alternative way to look at it. So let's look at the possibilities for integrating faith and science. Scientists in the United States tend to believe less in God compared to the general public, but many scientists still retain religious beliefs. According to recent surveys of scientists in the United States by Pew Research Center and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, about half of scientists believe in God and half do not. Now, that may sound, it's a half is glass full, the glass is half full versus the glass is half empty thing. You know, you can look at this as, see, look, scientists are atheists, but you can also look at it as, see, look, many scientists still believe in God. Just a matter of how you look at it. Disbelief varies by specific disciplines. In a 2007 survey by Rice University sociologist Elaine Howard Eklund and Christopher Sheetal, and I'm not sure for how to pronounce the name, the fields of physics and biology have the highest number of atheists at 40%. So that's the subfields, 40%. That is the field that has the highest number of atheists. But overall, atheists make up between 30 to 40% across the scientific disciplines. only 30, and since we're talking about psychology, only 33% of psychologists actually would describe themselves as atheist. Interestingly, according to a survey by the University of Chicago in 2005, 76% of medical doctors believe in God and 59% believe in an afterlife. So it's possible that the more philosophical side of the sciences attracts people who are less inclined to believe in God than those involved in healing people. So it's an interesting way to look at it. Nevertheless, faith and science do not have to be opposed to each other. And that's the point I hope you can take away from this. It is possible to value the role of science and faith at the same time, as many famous scientists have believed in God too, such as René Descartes, Galileo Galilei, and Albert Einstein. He had a more pantheistic concept of God, but he'd still believe in some kind of God out there. And interestingly, the people who talk about the God of the gaps forget that it was a Christian who came up with the phrase God of the gaps. He was an evangelist. Professor Henry Drummond was a biologist and a Christian evangelist. He intended this, he came up with this phrase to talk about how Christians use science. And the phrase was not intended to discredit theism, but simply to highlight the fallacy of using the gap arguments to prove God's existence. In other words, using intelligent design or these things that look at nature as a way to prove the existence of God, because there will always be the potential for scientific explanations. But even scientists who are Christians do not like the God of the gaps approach, because it says that whenever science increases, the spiritual realm decreases. But it is not necessary to squeeze God into the gaps of the leftovers of science. It's possible that God works through scientific laws of nature. And that's why I use this picture here of a puzzle with a picture of a nature setting in it. And that's because it's in the puzzle where we see God, not that we only assign God to the missing pieces. And that brings us to the point of, if we were to really believe that the sciences is compatible with God, then what does science teach us about the author of science? While Stephen Hawking was an atheist, he once wrote in his book, A Brief History of Time, if we find an answer to why the universe exists, it would be the ultimate triumph of human reason, for then we would know the mind of God. While Hawking spoke of God in a figurative sense, many believe that the laws of nature do teach us about the mind of God. Even Jesus Christ used the science of nature to illuminate spiritual lessons. He taught lessons from nature by using parables. While people mostly think of these as allegorical moral stories, they are comparisons or case studies that illustrate spiritual principles by way of analogy. They might be thought of using anecdotal observations from the natural world. In Matthew 13, Matthew writes, Jesus spoke all these things to the multitude in parables, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, saying, I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter things which have been kept secret from the foundation of the world. And that is basically like the science of the universe, how we understand the origins of the universe and things like that. All these can be taught to us through looking at nature. And Ellen White, in her book on these parables, in her book Christ's Object Lessons, she writes a lot about the subject. She writes that natural things were the medium for the spiritual. The things of nature and the life experience of his hearers were connected with the truths of the written word. Leading thus from the natural to the spiritual kingdom, Christ's parables are like links in the chain of truth that unites man with God and earth with heaven. It's not links as far as the missing puzzle kind that we were talking about earlier, but rather these are truth where we can see the hand of God in science and nature, and it allows us to see how truth is all the same. You know, it's not a spiritual truth versus a scientific truth, but that all truth is God's truth. and that unites man with God and earth with heaven. There's no distinction between supernatural and natural. Unfortunately, we still live in a world of decay and death and dying. And so obviously, death and decay are widespread throughout nature. While the world may be marred and defiled, the beauty in it still speaks to a higher purpose or an intelligent designer. White continues that it was Christ's goal to draw the veil aside so that we can see that beauty. And she writes, bringing to view the spiritual glory that all things were created to reflect. His words placed the teachings of nature as well as of the Bible in a new aspect and made them a new revelation. So it's not the Bible versus nature, but that both nature and the Bible reveal God to us. And science, just like people study theology to study the Bible, science is the study of nature, and that helps us to understand God. Many scientists, in a letter that Albert Einstein wrote, someone asked him if Einstein believed in God, and he wrote something to the effect that, when scientists study nature, they cannot help but come away with this feeling that they are studying something divine. So here's a beautiful picture that just illustrates how Christ is seeking to pull that veil aside so that we can see the beauty. It's so easy to see all the decay and death in the world, but yet there's still beauty in nature around us. Christians believe that both nature or science and scripture teaches us about God. So how do we integrate faith and psychology specifically? Because Christians have been suspicious of psychology, Christians tend to have varying positions on how they integrate their faith and psychology. Therefore, Eric Johnson's research shows that there are 5 levels of integration, going from completely separate to completely the same. So let's just briefly touch on this. Number 1 is levels of explanation. Psychology and theology are completely separate fields that offer alternative perspectives on human nature and are best left separate. That's not something I believe. Number 2 is integrationism. Neither the Bible nor science has all the answers to human nature and therefore need to be integrated to have a complete picture of humanity. Yeah, I can see that. It's something I would probably be supportive of. Then there's Christian psychology. There are multiple ways of doing psychology or psychologies, and Christianity offers a way of merging theology with psychology. And this is a way a lot of people, a lot of Christian psychologists work, and that's how they see it. And then there is transformational psychology, and these people believe that the only good way to do psychology effectively is by being faithful to God and loving to others like Jesus would. Now, just to be clear, what they're not saying is necessarily you have to read the Bible to people, but that being a Christian in the truest sense of the word, representing God's love, is transformational. That's why it's called transformational psychology. And that transformational approach is what changes people. The only question I have about that is, where does science fit into that? And then the last approach is biblical counseling. And these people believe that the Bible offers the true way of understanding humanity and Christianity is a way of healing humanity. And so I know people who are biblical counselors, and they're respected. I respect them, and they teach at sister institutions. While I respect them, I disagree with this approach, to be honest, because many people I work with, it's not to say that I don't believe in the Bible. Let's just be clear about that. But the issue is that I have many people who do not believe in the Bible, and I want to still be able to help them, even if we don't necessarily share that in common. And so oftentimes biblical counselors are only trained in how to quote the Bible at people, and I'm like, well, what if they don't accept that as their authority? And the other thing I take issue with is while I obviously the Bible is very authoritative and has a lot of truth in it, I don't necessarily personally see it as a science manual or a manual on how to do therapy. And so, I see it as something that needs to be integrated with a scientific perspective as well. It doesn't have a list of diagnoses. It doesn't, it's not meant to be a textbook necessarily on psychology per se. Although it's very helpful, and it is authoritative in its own right, but that it's got to be read how it was intended to be read, and that's the way I look at it. So that leads me to the next point. Christians disagree on whether the Bible is a psychology manual that contains all of the answers for mental health, and whether science and faith are compatible. And so for me, I believe that science and faith are compatible, but I don't believe that the Bible is a psychology manual. I think that's an important distinction. It has important truth, but it was not written to be a guide on how you're supposed to do therapy per se. There isn't any instructions in it about it, but it is authoritative, and the area is meant to be. So I would say it's our belief in what I'm teaching, and you don't have to accept it, but this is what I believe. It's our belief that both faith and science are valid as different sources of truth. Not that they're the same, but that they're different sources of truth, and that they're reconcilable. That's an important distinction. So if the laws of nature or the natural world reveal spiritual principles, then there really is no need to believe in a spirit that lives apart from the physical body. Instead, the laws of nature, as applied to psychology in the Bible and the body, can have spiritual applications too. And so specifically, monism is a belief that rejects Descartes' mind-body dualism that says that the mind and body are separate, and rejects the view that there's a spirit floating around as a separate entity in the body. Instead, the mind and body are one and the same. Now, how do we believe that when I share this with other Christians, they will say, well, what about when people saw spirits and things like that? Aren't there spirits? Well, let's just take a look at some of the passages that people refer to. In Christian theology, this is based on the view that death is non-consciousness. What I believe, and that is our scientific perspective, is that death is non-consciousness, and some would liken it to a sleep. And that seems to be more consistent with a scientific perspective. So how do we reconcile that? So I just want to take a brief moment, since we're talking about the integration of faith in science. I would like to talk about what is a soul from a scientific perspective, and what did the Bible say. The word soul comes from nephesh in Hebrew, which literally means a living creature or sentient being. The first 4 references in the Bible for soul actually refer to animals as living beings. So some people think that only humans have souls. That's actually not. That's actually not even biblical. The Bible refers to animals as being souls. So let's look at these passages. In Genesis 1:20, it says, "And God said, let the water teem with living creatures." That is the word nephesh, is translated as living creatures or sentient beings. "And let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky." In Genesis 1:21, it says, "So God created the great creatures of the sea and of every living thing with which the water teems, and that moves about in it, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good." Again, you see that every living thing is translation of nephesh. And continuing on in verse 24, "And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so." So we see that, again, Nefesh, the soul, is actually just living creatures. And they just have different kinds. But they're all the same thing. They're all souls. They're all living creatures. We're all animals. In Genesis 1:30, and to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. And so these souls live on a plant-based diet, interestingly. And finally, in chapter 2, verse 7, it says, God breathed the breath of life into the dust of the ground, non-living matter, and man became a living being or soul. So it's very clear that this human does not have a soul, but it is a soul. It became a living being, a soul, when the dust of the ground or the non-living matter was combined with life. It became a living, sentient being. And that's really what a soul is. It's not some spirit that floats around. So when a person dies, they simply return to the ground. Genesis 3:19 says, dust you are, and to dust you will return. So when the breath of life departs, the non-living matter just goes back to dust. And then it ceases to be a soul. The soul disappears or goes to sleep, you might think, but there is no soul that runs around after we die. The Bible does not teach that people have a separate conscious, immortal spirit or mind that continues on after death. Instead, all consciousness ends at death. Ecclesiastes 9:5 and 10 says that the dead do not know or do anything. They literally are sleeping, resting in peace. There's nothing that they do not know what's going on because they're dead. So what about that thief on the cross? A lot of people look at that story and say, hey, well, Jesus told him, you will be with me in paradise, as soon as he dies. Well, if you read the passage, when Jesus told the thief on the cross, assuredly I say to you today, you will be with me in paradise, it's often thought Jesus was telling the thief that he would see him that day. However, Jesus did not even raise from the grave until Sunday. So it doesn't even make logical sense. How can he see him that day if he was dead until Sunday? And even then, even if you say, okay, well, maybe he went somewhere in the meantime, he told his disciples in John 20:17, do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. So he hadn't gone to the paradise yet. So there's no way he could have, it would have been a lie. If that's what he meant, then he was lying to the thief, saying, I say to you today, you will be with me in paradise. It's just not true. What he was saying, and so the issue in Greek is that there's no commas. What he was saying essentially is, I say to you today, I'm saying this today, you will be with me in paradise, but not necessarily today. That's an important clarification. A lot of people don't understand that. Another issue, this is more of a side note, this going beyond the scope of this class, but this popular concept of hellfire comes from Greek mythology, the underworld or realm of Hades. Unfortunately, hell anxiety is often found in people who have fears of being punished and abandoned, often those who suffer from childhood abuse and oppression, which really raises the question, if our beliefs create fear and are not helping us create better relationships with others and with God, then it's not really good news. But people have to understand that where did they get this idea from? It's actually the idea of hell as an eternal torment and fire. It's not even consistent with the idea of a loving God. It's more of a psychopath, a killer. But the reality is that in the Bible, hell is simply the final destruction of unbelievers or the second death, or an annihilation of unbelievers. In the end, the world will be restored, and there will be no more death, no sorrow, no crying. So when it says there shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away, how can that be true if there's still some people being burned in hell? No, the idea of hell in the Revelation is just a temporary place where people are burned up, but it's not ongoing. So this doctrine of eternal torment is really, it's inconsistent with the loving God, but it's often used to scare people into obeying God out of fear. And this is one of the greatest obstacles people have in accepting Christian teachings and the Bible, because of this I think it's a sick doctrine, a sick teaching that there's a God who would burn people for eternity. And I have met clients who are scared of God and scared of going to hell. And what kind of religion is that that's going to, mess people up in the head and get scared and cause anxiety because of that? That's I wouldn't want to believe that either. Thankfully, it's not true. And that's the good news I hope to share with people. When Jesus' friend Lazarus died, Jesus said he was sleeping. He was simply sleeping in the grave. However, the story of Jesus resurrecting Lazarus shows that if immortality ever came to humanity, it would only be a gift that occurs at the resurrection, not something we currently have. Until then, when we die, we die. And you know what? That's a scientific perspective. There is no evidence that anything goes on after death. That is actually more scientific if you really think about it, because right now that's all we know. When you die, you die. And that's basically it. The only way we'd ever live on after that is if God really resurrected us from the dead. And in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul writes, "Listen, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For the perishable must clothe itself with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality. When the perishable has been clothed with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality, then the saying that is written will come true. Death has been swallowed up in victory." I think there's good news and hope there. Obviously, I don't want to go too far into this because this is outside the scope of our class. But, unfortunately, the teachings about hell has created a lot of anxiety, and the teachings about a spirit that exists apart from the body is just not compatible with a scientific perspective. But that doesn't mean we can't still have hope and that there's still something to look forward to. Those who hold a monistic view reject spiritualism, or the idea that human spirits persist after death. This has been debunked as unscientific. When we die, we die. The view that there's no separate immortal spirit that exists has important implications for psychology, as it better fits the scientific view of the mind. Because if you think about it, people who believe in a spirit might have a hard time explaining how when you damage your brain, it fundamentally can affect your personality and your behavior. But if you have a holistic perspective, it's very easy to understand that you need to take care of your body and your brain because that affects your spirituality. A monistic view also means we need to take better care of our bodies because it has implications for us psychologically and spiritually. So that leads us to the next point, a biopsychosocial model of health. The medical fields have historically used a biological disease model of health. This model of health tends to be reactive after illness or diseases arises. Now we understand more about the important role that psychology and mental health play in driving our overall health. Therefore, a better model of health is the biopsychosocial model with a focus on prevention through lifestyle. Where does that leave spirituality? Spirituality is important to our health as it affects our health through the psychological and social domains. However, people who are not religious tend to be suspicious of talking about spirituality, while religious people tend to be suspicious of attempts to leave out spirituality. I think we have to have better integration. There's got to be a way to integrate them. When I'm working with clients, I'm respectful of people from wherever they are. I work with people of all faiths. I work with atheists. But I also want to be attentive to the possibility that there may be spiritual issues as well. Religion and spirituality have important implications for our health, which we're going to see next. Religion and spirituality can have positive effects on our physical health, primarily because it offers us a way to cope with stress and provides a sense of community. It's been well documented that our relationship with God can have a positive effect on our health. However, to be clear, religion can also be toxic, and we're going to talk about that next. I just came across this article that was published recently in September 2019 by Valerie Tarico on rawstory.com. And she writes an article called Religious Trauma Syndrome. Psychologist reveals how organized religion can lead to mental health problems. I just want to share with you something she writes. Because I think her, even though I don't know if her ultimate goal is the same as what I would say, I do agree completely with the point she's making. And I think it's a very valid point. She writes this: at age 16, I began what would be a 4-year struggle with bulimia. When the symptoms started, I turned in desperation to adults who knew more than I did about how to stop shameful behavior, my Bible study leader and a visiting youth minister. If you ask anything in faith, believing, they said, it will be done. I knew they were quoting the Word of God. We prayed together and I went home confident that God had heard my prayers. But my horrible compulsions didn't go away. By the fall of my sophomore year in college, I was desperate and depressed enough that I made a suicide attempt. The problem wasn't just a bulimia. I was convinced by then that I was a complete spiritual failure. My college counseling department had offered to get me real help, which they later did. But to my mind, at that point, such help couldn't fix the core problem. I was a failure in the eyes of God. It will be years before I understand that my inability to heal bulimia through the mechanisms offered by biblical Christianity was not a function of my own spiritual deficiency, but deficiencies in evangelical religion itself. And this is one of the reasons why I take issue with using the Bible alone to the exclusion of a scientific approach as well. I'm not against using the Bible, but I think that it needs to be balanced out with modern medicine. Like people try to pray away cancer, like I've said before, and it doesn't. Then they're surprised that it doesn't work. We have to be willing to use and look at how God may be working through the avenues of science as well. So she interviewed Dr. Marlene Winell, who believed that religion can actually cause psychological problems, which is what I've been saying with regard to hell anxiety. She says, in her interview, she says, religious trauma syndrome, RTS, is a set of symptoms and characteristics that tend to go together and which are related to harmful experiences with religion. They are the result of two things: immersion in a controlling religion and the secondary impact of leaving a religious group. The RTS label provides a name and description that affected people often recognize immediately. Many other people are surprised by the idea of RTS because in our culture it is generally assumed that religion is benign or good for you. But in reality, religious teachings and practices sometimes cause serious mental health damage. Bible-based religious groups that emphasize patriarchal authority and family structure and use harsh parenting methods can be destructive. I've had many clients who had OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, or something because they're afraid that God was going to punish them because of their sexual desires or because of something else. And I think these are all, unfortunately, toxic beliefs. I think we have to be able to engage and challenge religious beliefs, especially when they are toxic. So I think it's important that religion can be toxic, but it depends on if it emphasizes love and forgiveness rather than punishment and guilt. And that's actually what science shows. Religion can be helpful, but it can also be toxic. It just depends on what kind of religion. Some people have a toxic religion. And so you have to ask yourself, what kind of religion do you have? Now, the good news, here's the good news. Religion actually, for the most part, is beneficial. It's just unfortunate many people have bad experiences. But overall, the average life expectancy of those who attend church or religious services compared to those who do not, after comparing for similar health behavior, is 7 years longer compared to those who do not attend religious services. That's really important. That means there's actual health benefits. Now, of course, there may be factors we have to look at, such as, does it provide social support and that sort of thing, which is obviously it does. But it has to be said that overall religion has protective factors, and other research has shown that people who go to church and are religious tend to be less involved in high risk behaviors. They're more likely to care for themselves. So that's good news there. That brings us to the subject of blue zones. Daniel Bletner is an educator and journalist who has traveled around the world producing award-winning documentaries for National Geographic. He is well known for his exploration of blue zones, areas where a high number of people live longer than 100 years old. One of these 3 areas he discusses is in Loma Linda, California. I happen to have lived in Loma Linda for a decade. When I first moved to this town east of Los Angeles, one of the first things I noticed were all the people out jogging or bicycling alongside the roads, including gray-haired seniors. And here's a picture of Marge Jeton. She just died recently at the age of 106. She was featured in Daniel Bletner's research and publication on the subject. And this is a picture of her weightlifting every morning. And she looks pretty tough for her age, hundreds. And she would volunteer in the community and that sort of thing. And there's something, how do people get like this? That's because there's this culture that promotes health. It's a culture that promoted health because it's a home to many Seventh-day Adventist Christians. Because of their monistic or non-dualistic view of human nature, this denomination emphasizes living healthy, which encompasses all aspects of their lifestyle, including diet. According to Daniel Bletner, the cultures that live the longest usually eat a plant-based diet. And that's one of the things Seventh-day Adventists promote. Not all Seventh-day Adventists are vegetarian, but many are. I myself am a Seventh-day Adventist who happens to be a vegetarian as well. So I want to share with you a little about the background. I do believe that the Seventh-day Adventist Church can serve as an example for how Christian churches today can integrate psychology and faith because of its diversity and unique blend of perspectives from opposite ends of the political and theological spectrum. I can't think of a better example that can illustrate how we can perfectly integrate. Of course, I'm biased, and I teach it at a Seventh-day Adventist institution, but I personally can't think of any better examples that illustrates how we can perfectly blend psychology, science with our faith. The Seventh-day Adventist denomination is a Protestant Christian denomination that teaches the Bible is inspired and is authoritative, in contrast to the churches of the past that taught doctrines based on tradition. So it's very much rooted in this tradition. It's the sola scriptura tradition. And as a Protestant denomination, they teach that salvation comes through a faith or trusting relationship with Jesus Christ alone. Now, that may not be the case for all Adventists, I'll be honest, but as a denomination, that's what the official position. That's what we teach. The name Seventh-day Adventist refers to its distinctive observance of Saturday, the seventh day of the Christian and Jewish calendars, as a Sabbath, a holy day of the week. And the founders of this denomination came from various Protestant churches, and through study of the Bible, combined what they believed was the best theology from Lutheran, Wesleyan, Armenian, or Methodist, and Anabaptist branches of Protestant Christianity. And I just want to share, too, first of all, that they actually resisted establishing a unique or a separate identity because it actually started out as a broad, loosely tied movement. But because many of the founders were kicked out from the original churches and because they wanted to establish some cohesiveness, it was considered more of a necessary evil that they eventually came up with the name Seventh-day Adventist and established their own church, just to have some kind of unity. But I think it's lost on many people today that it began as a large, broad movement. And unfortunately, has many times become more like an exclusive cult, where people see this as an us versus them thing, where, we're separate from everybody else. And that may be a natural tendency for a lot of more conservative religious groups. But that was not the intention of the early founders. And that's the spirit and attitude that I try to hold. I don't even like to identify myself as a Seventh-day Adventist. I actually like to consider myself as just like any other Christian, that we're all part of the same movement. Actually, and that I don't even like to consider myself as a distinctive identity as being Christian apart from other religious groups, because I like to think that we're all fellow travelers in this road of life. Muslims, Jewish, Buddhist, we're all in the boat of life. And sometimes when we use these labels, religious labels, it sets us apart from other people. And that's really an unfortunate cult-like mentality, which is actually very different from the attitude of the founders of this church. So I like to see that we're all part of the same boat of life. Adventists, now, because of the early founders they put a lot of emphasis on the Bible, and that's how they studied and developed their teachings. But they also had one of the co-founders, Ellen White, had a spiritual gift of prophecy. That's what many people believed, but that her writings are subordinate to testing by the Bible, which is the ultimate authority. So they really believed that the Bible is the authority. She was never an official leader, nor was she was not a denominational president. She was never worshipped, and she never even claimed the title of prophet or anything like that. She the most she ever said was that she had messages from the Lord, and that was it. But she never claimed the title of prophet or anything. In her writings, she always pointed people to Jesus Christ as the authority, as revealed in the Bible. And that's an important distinction, because I know many denominations who actually have prophets today, and they use it, and they tell people that. And sometimes you have to question their motives. If anything, she had a more humble attitude and was not trying to lord it over, and she never even talked about it that much. The denomination today has a global presence with churches, hospitals, and school systems around the world. The list here is just for the United States, but hospitals have been established around the world. Outside of the Catholic Church, the Seventh-day Adventists have the second largest school systems and hospital systems around the world. And because of its global presence, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is the most racially diverse Christian denomination in the United States, and it's one of the fastest growing in the United States due to immigrants coming from around the world. It really is the most racially diverse. So I want to look a little about, just to give some context and background about Seventh-day Adventists, but I'm really interested in the legacy of Adventist healthcare, because it teaches us how we can integrate faith and psychology and faith and science. Ellen White, who I was talking about earlier, was inspired by her love for Jesus to share what she learned with others. In 1848, shortly after the start of the Advent movement, Ellen White was 17 and in poor health. She was emaciated, weighing only 80 pounds, and had a nervous condition. That's when she had a vision dealing with healthy living. As a result, her own health improved, and she discouraged the use of stimulants like tea, coffee, and tobacco. In 1863, while praying for her husband James, Ellen White had her first major vision on the subject of health. She said, "We have a duty to speak, to come out against intemperance of every kind, intemperance in working, in eating, in drinking, and in drugging," or use of drugs. So she inspired her church's emphasis on health reform, and she advocated for a healthy diet. She warned against eating animal meat, especially swine, and against alcohol and tobacco, which were medically accepted in her time. So I want to share with you a brief video. This is courtesy of Advent Health Florida, and they have several videos that just show the history of whole person care from an Adventist perspective. This one is the role of James and Ellen White as they develop these principles of whole person health and caring for patients.
In the mid-1800s, a spiritual revival was sweeping the country. Thousands were searching the scriptures, anticipating the soon coming of Christ. James and Ellen White were part of this movement. After years of study, they joined a small group of like-minded believers who established the Seventh-day Adventist Church in 1863. James and Ellen were committed. Inspired by their love for Jesus, they traveled by train, wagon, and even sleigh in the wintertime, preaching and working to establish this new denomination. Their dedication pushed them, yet James still found time to start a publishing house, which eventually printed more than 5,000 articles and 40 books written by Ellen on topics of temperance, faith, and the Bible. The long hours and grueling schedule affected James's health, and he suffered a paralyzing stroke. Doctors believed he would never recover. Ellen resolved to help her husband and arranged for him to be admitted to a popular facility for healing in Danville, New York. After a short stay, Ellen was impressed that Christ had shown her a better way. What James really needed was God's plan for healthy living, fresh air, a healthy diet, and physical and mental activity. Committing to this new lifestyle, they returned home to their farm in Michigan, where James made a remarkable recovery. Ellen was convinced that spirituality and physical health were connected, a concept that at the time was not widely accepted. She believed Adventists should build their own health reform institutions, places where people could learn how to stay healthy through cooking classes, water therapy, and the best of medicine. She and her husband presented the idea to other church leaders. 1 year later in Battle Creek, Michigan, the Western Health Reform Institute opened its doors on September 5, 1866. Founded on the conviction that healthcare was vital to the Adventist mission to relieve human suffering. What started as a small beginning set in motion the growth of Adventist healthcare that today touches millions of lives around the world. And now you know even more of the whole story.
Ellen White had another vision in 1865 on the need to lead in healthcare. So in 1866, Adventists launched the Western Health Reform Institute in Battle Creek, Michigan. Its name was later changed to the Battle Creek Sanitarium. This is a picture of that there. At the turn of the 20th century, they drew hundreds of thousands of patients from around the world, including John Rockefeller, J.C. Penney, inventor Thomas Edison, Booker T. Washington, aviator Amelia Earhart, and President William Howard Taft is a 100,000th patient. Unfortunately, the sanitarium burned down. Sanitariums, though, the positive thing was that sanitariums were subsequently established all over the country and eventually grew to 200 hospitals around the world, or probably even more now today. The sanitarium in Loma Linda, California became Loma Linda University Health, which has the church's leading medical school and teaching hospital, and is a blue zone today. There's a picture of the original sanitarium and the newest building they just built below it. And we're more closer to where I'm at, the Washington Sanitarium was established in Tacoma Park, Maryland in 1907, and it was later renamed as the Washington Adventist Hospital, and Washington Adventist University came later, and that's where I currently teach at. Now, the hospital recently moved to White Oak, Maryland, just near us. It's a beautiful hospital, just recently opened. So Adventists teach a whole person approach to health. They advocate for a whole person health and the prevention of disease through lifestyle changes. I want to share with you a brief video, a couple minutes long, about the legacy of Adventist healthcare, 150 years of health and healing.
Across America, from the mountain states to the Midwest, from the East and South, in sleepy towns and bustling cities, the work of Adventist Health System is defined by a unifying thread that winds through more than 150 years of a health and healing legacy. In the mid-1800s, health and long lives were rare. Good health care was practically non-existent, and doctors often prescribed odd elixirs and treatments, some of which were as harmful as the diseases they promised to cure. People were afraid of night air, and bloodletting was still a common practice. But several founders of the newly organized Seventh-day Adventist Christian Church had a better idea. They believed God had already provided the best remedies in nature, and they turned their attention to prevention, suggesting that fresh air, sunshine, rest, exercise, nutritious food, and clean water could help people stay healthier. They also proposed that a simple diet rich in nutritious foods would help build stamina and strength. Health reformers, led by James and Ellen White and other early Seventh-day Adventists, looked at the life of Jesus Christ and wanted to follow in his ways, caring for those who were hurting, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. With this mission in mind, these pioneers launched the Western Health Reform Institute in Battle Creek, Michigan on September 5, 1866. They had limited staff, an 8-room house, and just one patient. They also had more faith than medical know-how, but they were determined to follow the Creator's footsteps. Pooling their resources, the church members managed to put several students through medical school. One was 23-year-old John Harvey Kellogg, who became medical director of the Institute in 1876 and changed its name to the Battle Creek Sanitarium. Dr. Kellogg was an avid reader who traveled the world to increase his medical knowledge and improve the work of the sanitarium. He was also a prolific inventor, developing procedures, surgical techniques, and medical equipment, much of which influenced the medical care we know today. In an effort to provide an easy and nourishing option to the typical unhealthy breakfast of that time, Kellogg ground corn and formed it into ready-to-eat flakes. His brother, who worked with him, later started the cereal company that still carries the family name today. Dr. Kellogg's expertise and innovations were widely known, and in the late 1800s through the early 1900s, the Battle Creek Sanitarium drew patients from around the world. Some of the most famous of these were John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil, department store founder J.C. Penney, inventor Thomas Edison, African-American educator and author Booker T. Washington, and aviator Amelia Earhart. William Howard Taft, the 27th President of the United States, was the 100,000th patient of Dr. Kellogg and the Battle Creek Sanitarium. On a cold winter night in 1902, as Kellogg was out of town, the Battle Creek Sanitarium caught fire and burned to the ground. Undeterred by the disheartening news, Kellogg immediately boarded a train for Battle Creek. By the time he arrived, he had already sketched out plans for building a new and even grander sanitarium. This began an era of rapid development of like-minded institutions all over the country. Boulder Sanitarium in 1893, Hinsdale Sanitarium in 1905, and in that same year in Southern California, an abandoned hotel was purchased and Loma Linda Sanitarium was opened for care and medical education. Today, Loma Linda University Health ranks as one of the top-rated medical schools in the country. In 1908, Florida Sanitarium in Orlando was founded in faith by a small group of church members, including one person who mortgaged his own home for the down payment. Today, Adventist Health System employees, diverse in culture and backgrounds, find opportunities to provide highly advanced levels of care in a Christ-centered environment that encourages the health and healing of the whole person. Adventist Health System hospitals, outpatient centers, and nursing homes extend the healing ministry of Christ as far north as Wisconsin, as far west as Colorado, and as far south as Texas and Florida. Adventist Health System, reaching out, touching hearts, healing lives.
So Seventh-day Adventists use a whole person biopsychosocial spiritual model of health. The denomination's Adventist Health Ministries devised an acronym Celebrations for 12 healthful living principles. And Advent Health, formerly known as Florida Hospital in Orlando, Florida, devised the Creation Health model. I'm going to share with you their acronyms. So Celebration stands for choices, exercise, liquid, environment, belief, rest, air, and temperance, integrity, optimism, nutrition, and social support and service. That's Celebrations. And Creation Health stands for choices, rest, environment, activity, trust, interpersonal relationships, outlook, and nutrition. So you can see that they really teach this whole person approach, and they try to have this acronym that illustrates that. And I like these because in contrast to some of the older models like New Start, which used to be a big one, These actually integrate more psychology, like optimism, interpersonal relationships, and trust. This is a picture from the Creation Help that just nicely illustrates the acronym. So let's just talk briefly, really quickly, about how psychology is viewed among Seventh-day Adventists today. Many Christians, including Adventists, were historically suspicious of psychology and counseling, as a lot of Christians. Even Ellen White wrote concerning mesmerism and phrenology. Well, you have to understand, because that in her day, Sigmund Freud hadn't even come along yet, and mesmerism and phrenology were still popular. And there were still people performing lobotomies and cutting into the brain. Bloodletting was still common. About 51% of Adventists seek counseling as a last resort. Still, unfortunately, probably because the writings weren't really updated, because she only lived during that time. So people still have this suspicion. So while there's concern about mind control, thankfully, most Adventists do not equate counseling with that. Yet most Adventists don't understand that pastors are not qualified mental health professionals. So that's still an issue that we still struggle with. However, Ellen White had a lot to write about the subject, and even supported genuine sciences related to the mind. And along with an emphasis on rest, exercise, and water, she stressed the importance of a healthy mind. She writes, "I saw that we should encourage a cheerful, hopeful, peaceful frame of mind, for our health depends upon our doing this." And Dr. John Cannon, W. John Cannon, established the first psychology major for an Adventist college at Washington Adventist University, or what used to be. I don't know if it was Columbia Union College back then or not, but it was Washington Adventist University in 1961. And it took a while due to the suspicions of psychology among the church leadership, but eventually they allowed it. So he helped compile 2 volumes of Ellen White's writings on psychology and mind, character, and personality. And this compilation is referred to a lot in my series and in my workbooks. So let's look. I'm going to end an overview by looking at Seventh-day Adventist assumptions about psychology, kind of nicely wrap everything up. So Ellen White wrote that the true principles of psychology are found in the Holy Scriptures. Man knows not his own value. That's found in the first volume of Mind, Character, and Personality. Seventh-day Adventists typically hold the following assumptions, and this comes from several sources I found from other professors of psychology in Adventist institutions. And this is a summary of their assumptions. They believe that science and faith are compatible and seek to integrate or reconcile both in the practice of psychology. They do not feel they have to choose one or the other. They typically believe in creation or intelligent design as the origin of the world, as indicated by biblical accounts in Genesis. However, I would also say that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't also believe in evolution. Many hold both in their mind, or they try to find ways to reconcile it. But because they believe in the Sabbath, they tend to put a lot of emphasis on that creation week and understanding the Sabbath as a memorial of creation. Seventh-day Adventists tend to hold a monistic or non-dualistic anthropology or view of human nature. So they reject spiritualism or the belief in an immortal spirit that exists after death. They reject the belief that hell is a place of eternal torment and suffering. They do believe in a hell, but just not. It's not a place of eternal torment and suffering. They emphasize a wholeness approach to health rather than a disease or deficit approach. And specifically, they adopt a biopsychosocial spiritual model of health. And that lastly, they tend to take a humanistic view in seeing the good in humanity despite sin. And they emphasize that humans reflect the image of God as the essence of what it means to be human. And personally, I think that's how Jesus saw people. You know, he never saw people as prostitutes or sinners. Rather, he saw the potential in people. He saw people in their context. Like when the woman was caught in adultery, rather than judging her like everybody else was, he said, the one who is without sin cast the first stone. And he started writing sins in the sand. Basically he saw the good in her. He saw her in her context, given her past experiences. And I think that's the way I like to look at people too. Adventists also believe that God created the laws of nature and that it's in our best interest to understand these. And so rather than ignoring them because somehow we have some spirit that floats around, we think, hey, the laws of nature apply to us and we better pay attention. And lastly, they use empirical methods, which mean they look for objective evidence and scientific observations about the world as a basis for our knowledge. We're not anti-science at all. We want to integrate science and faith, and that's very important. But we also want to have empirical methods. That means that everything's based on some kind of evidence from nature. In conclusion, many people try to live healthy lives, but for various reasons, they get derailed. And that could be due to the messages from society and the culture that are not supportive. Whether it's a society that doesn't help us have healthy attitudes that are about our bodies or our diets. And our society can romanticize the use of alcohol and drugs. On the other hand, religion sometimes also contributes distorted thoughts as well. However, religion has been useful, has been beneficial in counteracting the negative messages from society by teaching people that they have intrinsic worth and value, and that they should take care of themselves because they're valuable. Integrating faith with science has been helpful in promoting healthy behavior. When the two have been balanced, that they can be very effective together. In romantic relationships, having different religions can be a source of stress and conflict because people have different values, or they believe they behave differently because of their beliefs. Religion has a lot of power in people's lives, for good or for bad. It can be helpful or it can be harmful, depending on how that power is wielded. Religion can be misused to control people, and it can keep them trapped through guilt and shame. So that's why it's important to look at what kinds of do we have toxic beliefs. And so as a counselor, I look at spiritual beliefs, because they can be a source of problems too. So specific beliefs that the mind exists apart from the body has contributed to people not taking care of their health because they think, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to their spirituality, or that it's not going to affect them anyway, or that they can somehow override their biology because they somehow will it to. And the reality is that both, our mind and body are the same, and so we have to treat it like any other physical organ. We got to take care of our health. And the good thing is that religion can have a positive influence on people's lives by promoting healthy behavior and positive ways of coping with stress, and put it all together as one package. So let's look at spiritual perspectives on how we take care of our health next. The book of Daniel tells a story of how an ancient Hebrew man survived and thrived while in captivity under the Babylonian and Persian empires. Archaeological evidence has confirmed many of these details about the time recorded on tablets. When King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon conquered ancient Israel, Daniel marched from Israel to Babylon along with his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They were trained to serve the king. However, the four did not want to eat royal food and wine as their food, and alcohol. The non-kosher food and alcohol did not fit their religious practices. So, as Daniel was a man of prayer and faith, he resolved not to defile himself, according to Daniel 1:8. However, to prove that their diet was superior, he asked officials who oversaw them, quote, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." That's a pretty bold test, but he had a lot of courage and confidence that was going to work. So at the end of the 10 days, they appeared healthier than any of the other servants. The story says that after this, God gave them knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and the king found them none equal to them, so that they entered the king's service. So they were the best that they could get because somehow their faith contributed to overall positive health. And so this story illustrates interconnection between our mind, body, and spirituality. Daniel achieved superior intellectual ability by abstaining from alcohol and unhealthy food, and it shows that what we eat affects how we live. and the use of drugs and alcohol and poor lifestyle can impair our mental and spiritual health. So it takes me to the next point, basically looking at the connection between mind, body, and spirituality. Ellen White, who was one of the pioneers of the Adventist health message, she saw that in Daniel's story, how caring for our physical health is important to our moral and intellectual development. And she writes this in several places. She says, the life of Daniel is an inspired illustration of what constitutes a sanctified character. It presents a lesson for all, and especially for the young. A strict compliance with the requirements of God is beneficial to the health of body and mind. In order to reach the highest standard of moral and intellectual attainments, it is necessary to seek wisdom and strength from God and to observe strict temperance in all the habits of life. In the experience of Daniel and his companions, we have an instance of the triumph of principle over temptation to indulge this appetite. That's from the Review and Herald and Sanctified Life, page 23. So the body is very important to our spirituality, and our mind is part of the body. What does caring for our health then have to do with our psychology? It should be evident. When we understand that the mind is part of our body, then we recognize the importance of our physical health to our mental and spiritual health. When we abuse our bodies, we're essentially hurting our brains, which also hurts us spiritually as well. If the devil ever wanted to hurt us or attack us intellectually or spiritually, it would be through getting us to abuse our health. And that's why Ellen White writes that there's an important connection between our mind and body. She says this, the body is the most important medium through which the mind and the soul are developed for the upbuilding of character. Hence it is that the adversary's soul directs his temptations to the enfeebling and degrading of the physical powers. His success here often means the surrender of the whole being to evil. The tendencies of the physical nature, under the dominion of a higher power, will surely work ruin and death. The body is to be brought into subjection to the higher powers of the being. The passions are to be controlled by the will, which is itself to be under the control of God. The kingly power of reason, sanctified by divine grace, is to bear sway in the life. So, if the mind is very important, then that means that disease and a lack of health starts in our mind. So disease, as Ellen White says, starts with the sickness of the mind. Our mind is physical, so our mental health is the driver or leader for our physical health. Our minds direct us to take care of our health or not. Thus, if the devil wanted to attack our health, he would start with our mind, which would result in poor health. So as we will see when we discuss health psychology, physical health is often shaped by our mental health and vice versa. Ellen White writes, she continues to write that the majority of physical disease starts with the sickness of the mind. So she says this, Satan is the originator of disease, and the physician is warned against his work and power. Sickness of the mind prevails everywhere. 9/10 of the diseases from which men suffer have their foundation here. Perhaps some living home trouble is like a canker, eating to the very soul and weakening the life forces. Remorse for sin sometimes undermines the constitution and unbalances the mind. There are erroneous doctrines also as that of an eternally burning hell and the endless torment of the wicked that by giving exaggerated and distorted views of the character of God have produced the same result upon sensitive minds. In fact, she continues or describes psychological problems and, quote, hell anxiety, or as I would call it, as causing some of these physical problems. While critics of religion point out that religion tends to cause unhealthy beliefs that harm people, she believed that Christ is the antidote. It's not about religion, but about a relationship with Christ. She would say the religion of Christ, so far from being the cause of insanity that a lot of people believe, is one of its most effectual remedies, for it is a potent soother of the nerves. Yeah, many religions do cause anxiety, but a relationship with Christ is what helps. Learning the good news about Christ can set us free from fear, anxiety, guilt, shame, and other negative experiences. So lastly, I just want to mention briefly about health in the New Testament. The importance of caring for our health is seen in the New Testament as a response to what Jesus Christ did for us. Paul wrote, "Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own, you were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies." That's from 1 Corinthians 6:19-20. In other words, because God esteemed us highly enough to buy us with the life of Jesus, we should care for ourselves. And as a temple of the Holy Spirit, it means that we must avoid contaminating our bodies with substances and polluted thoughts, so we can have a clear mind to allow God's Spirit to live within us. And then we'll find peace and happiness, because we are at our peak, and we'll have a peak experience physically, mentally, and spiritually. And that's my prayer for you. I hope you can join me in that journey. And we're going to continue on our next chapter as we talk about the biological influences on our personality. We're going to look at trait theories and biological theories. And so the next one is called Who Am I? Thank you.